Hello, everyone. Welcome to another part of What If the Romans Never Fell? This time, part 7. And it is quite fitting because now we are entering the 17th century. Now, if you don't know what has happened already, please check out the previous videos because otherwise you'll not understand the context for this video. Done? Great. Let's get to it. In 1607, the Romans pretty much were the only colonial empire in Europe. But that all begins to change that year as the city of Jamestown is founded as the first permanent English colony. In 1609, the 12-year truce is signed with the Dutch, and so things look a little more hopeful, a little more peaceful. Between 1609 and 1619, Johannes Kepler discovers the three laws of planetary motion. In 1610, England founds a colony in Newfoundland, and in 1614, the New Netherlands is founded by the Dutch. Meanwhile, in 1618, Johannes Laurentius Bernini emerges as the major Baroque sculptor, another example of Roman artistic genius. But there will soon be no time for art, because this is the year the 30 Years' War breaks out, as Bohemia rebels against Roman and Catholic rule, and replaces its emperor with Frederick V of the Palatinate. The following year, he ascends the throne, while the Romans are invaded by Transylvania with Ottoman support, while Dutch Guyana, meanwhile, is also founded, further eroding Roman power worldwide. But the Romans are not to be underestimated. In 1620, at the Battle of White Mountain, the Bohemians are defeated by Johannes Tserclaes, the Count of Tilly, and are reintegrated into Rome. In 1621, the 80 Years' War with the Dutch resumes, as the Romans occupy the Palatinate, and the Dutch begin to fear for themselves. In 1625, Saxony and Brandenburg's fear of Roman domination of Germany leads them to ally with Denmark to resume the 30 Years' War, but they immediately start losing the war to the Romans, who are led by Albertus de Wallenstein. In 1629, peace with Denmark is achieved as it abandons its support for the Protestants and is weakened. However, Rome passes the Act of Restitution to restore all Catholic land taken since 1555, and what could have been avoided does not, and Rome once again causes more religious warfare to break out. Now, 1630, Dutch Brazil is created, while Sweden, under Gustavus Adolphus, begins its intervention and defeating the Romans. In 1637, in the scientific world, Renatus Cartesius, another Roman scientist, publishes Discourses on the Method, which officially establishes the scientific method. Meanwhile, the following year, England took Belize and the Mosquito Coast, while in 1640 the Dutch seized Dejima. In 1641, the Catalans, tired of heavy taxes, declare an independent republic. But, in more good news, by 1643, Dutch Brazil had mostly been reconquered by the Romans. In 1648, the 30 and 80 Years' Wars finally end, with the Dutch gaining independence, and Rome losing any influence beyond its borders in Europe and becoming severely weakened. It also ends the European wars of religion, as the transition from church to state ends with the state's victory. But in 1651, Rome receives its own victory as it reconquers the Catalan Republic. Back to the artistic world, in 1652, Bernini completes the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, the quintessential Baroque sculpture, and an amazing example of Roman and Catholic sculpture. Between 1656 and 1667, the Romans, impressed with Bernini's talent, designed St. Peter's Square in the Baroque style. In 1666, meanwhile, the Imperial Academy of Sciences is created. Now, the middle of the 17th century is relatively peaceful. In 1682, modern-day Louisiana, which is called Carolina because of the fact that the Roman emperor at the time was called Charles, is founded. And between 1682 and 1704, the Romans take over the entire Mississippi Valley as part of one massive colony known as the Colony of Carolina. But in 1683, this newfound peace ends as the Great Turkish War breaks out, as the Ottomans attack Vienna, but are repelled by the Romans with a little bit of help from John III Sobieski of Poland. Now, the Romans quickly take advantage of this, and between 1684 and 1690, the Romans conquer Hungary. Also, in 1686, a new player emerges, one which, may become important later, Russia, which joins the Holy Alliance, and this marks its first involvement in European affairs under its new Tsar, a guy you might have heard of, Peter the Great. In 1687, at the Second Battle of Mohacs, the Ottomans are decisively beaten. Meanwhile, Isaac Newton publishes his Principia Mathematica, and this marks the end of the scientific revolution and the beginning of the Enlightenment, which the Roman Empire will play a major role in. Now, back in Isaac Newton's country, in 1689, the Glorious Revolution happens, and England's deposed monarch flees to the Roman Empire, where he is related to the imperial family. Between 1695 and 1697, a huge famine kills 2 million Romans. And in 1699, the Great Turkish War ends in Roman victory. And so we now enter the 18th century, which hopefully will be a little better than the previous, except for the fact that Emperor Charles V dies, and this prompts a succession crisis. In 1701, the War of the Roman Succession breaks out, after the Catholic James II of England dies. He is succeeded by his daughter Anne, a Protestant, but her half-brother James contests the English throne, and being named the Roman successor as well, claims both thrones. Now, nobody wants to see a more powerful Rome, and England does not want a Catholic monarch again, and passes the Act of Settlement, and so it forms a Protestant coalition with the Netherlands and Prussia against the Romans, who take Newfoundland. Between 1702 and 1706, the Netherlands are able to take the rest of the Low Countries. In 1703, Rome takes Maine for a year, while Rákóczi's War of Independence breaks out as Hungary attempts to take advantage of the chaos to gain independence from Rome. In 1704, at the Battle of Blenheim, Rome's only major ally, Bavaria, is forced out of the war, while it suffers another defeat when the English and Dutch capture Gibraltar. Now in 1705, it reconquers Maine, 1706 loses Newfoundland, 1707 conquers South Carolina from the now unified Great Britain. But in 1708 and 1709, the Great Frost causes misery as one of the coldest winters ever recorded. In 1709, Rome takes the Hudson Bay. 1710, it takes Nova Scotia. In 1711, Jamestown is taken, while Rákóczi's War of Independence ends in his failure and Hungary is reintegrated into the Roman Empire. In 1704, the war ends, with Rome decisively winning, but James fails to install himself as the British king, while George I instead takes the throne. Now, James realizes that the chances of his dynasty taking Britain are unlikely. But Rome does end up conquering Hudson Bay, Newfoundland, and Nova Scotia. But this comes with a compromise of Portugal gaining autonomy as a Roman vassal. Now, in 1716, the Romans will go to war once again with their old enemies, the Ottomans, and Prince Eugene of Savoy defeats them at the Battle of Petrovaradin. In 1717, Belgrade is captured, and in 1718, Rome wins the war, expanding into the Balkans. During this time, by the way, Texas is also conquered by the Romans. Now, during the 1730s, the Rococo style emerges, emphasizing over-decoration and exaggeration in art and dress, which pretty much is an even more extreme form of Baroque art, architecture, and fashion. Meanwhile, in 1733, the Enlightenment really begins to be seen as Voltaire publishes his Letters on the English, which criticizes the Roman government and praises the society and government of one of its greatest enemies, Great Britain. Now, between 1737 and 1739, Rome loses some land to the Ottomans during another Roman-Ottoman War. Then, in 1740, a new man takes the throne of a small and insignificant country known as Prussia. But this is no ordinary king. This is Frederick the Great, and he conquers Silesia. This sparks an 8-year war, after which Rome, against all expectation, actually loses Silesia. Meanwhile, things are hardly better on the home front as Montesquieu publishes The Spirit of Law, in which he advocates for constitutional government, separation of powers, abolishing slavery, and preserving civil liberties, all of which pose a massive threat to the Roman way of life. In 1750, Rome and Portugal establish a border in South America. In 1751, the first edition of the Encyclopedia is published by Dionysius Diderot, the representation of Enlightenment thought. In 1755, Johannes Jacobus Rousseau publishes his Discourse on Inequality, in which he states that inequality ultimately comes from private property, and this is in response to a prize competition held by the University of Dijon, asking where inequality originates from. Now, in 1756, Great Britain allies Prussia, which invades Saxony, and this sparks the 7 Years' War. The following year, Prussia begins losing after being defeated by the Russians in East Prussia and the Romans in Bohemia, but reverses these defeats at the Battle of Leuthen and occupies Swedish Pomerania. Meanwhile, the British defeat the Roman ally Siraj ud Dowlah at the Battle of Plassey, which begins their expansion into India as they turn Bengal into a British vassal. In 1758, Russia occupies East Prussia. In 1759, at the Battle of Kunersdorf, Frederick loses half his army and is about to give up. Meanwhile, New Cordoba is taken by the British, who also defeat the new Roman armada sent to invade them. In 1760, all of the Carolinas have been taken by the Romans, while Russia briefly occupies Berlin. In 1761, being attacked on all sides and losing all of its ports, Prussia's defeat seems almost inevitable, and all the Romans and Russians have to do is just wipe him off. But in 1762, everything changes, as Empress Elizabeth of Russia dies and is succeeded by Prussophile Peter III, who immediately withdraws from the war. Cuba is taken by the British, who encourage the Portuguese to rebel and defeat the invading Romans at the Battle of Valencia de Alcantara and push them back. The British also take the capital of Roman India at Pondicherry, ending any real Roman presence there. At home, Rousseau publishes a social contract, criticizing absolute monarchy and the divine right of kings, and arguing that power should come from the people. The following year, the war ends, with a Roman defeat and the loss of Hudson's Bay, Florida, and Carolina. Meanwhile, Portugal is also granted independence. Things in Europe stay the same, but the Roman Golden Age finally comes to an end, and after 310 years, Great Britain replaces Rome as the major European power and becomes a global leader. And soon, the Industrial Revolution begins there too, making Great Britain, not Rome, the most powerful commercial and political power in the world. This also results in the enormous increase in efficiency and the real beginning of capitalism and the science of economics. And so, what will Rome do? How will it react to being replaced by Britain as the preeminent European and global power? Well, stay tuned for that, because it's going to be interesting. Now, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share if you found this interesting, and I will see you all next time.